and welcome to the first podcast by Young Thinkers Gloucester. And we're hoping to do a lot more episodes in this series. So this is the first of many, hopefully. I'll introduce our organisation. I'll introduce our guest speaker today, and then we'll get started. So Young Thinkers Gloucester is a voluntary organisation that helps the Barton and Tredworth community with different health and education initiatives. This includes a Saturday study club at the Friendship Cafe for children in years 2 to 7, CPR and first aid events, and supporting university applicants with mock interviews and work experience. And as I said, today's episode is hopefully the first of a series on different health and education topics. We're very grateful to have Mr. Koye with us today, who's our special guest. Mr. Odutola is a consultant trauma and orthopaedic surgeon, Deputy Clinical Chair and Clinical Director for Surgery at Weston General Hospital. He's had a personal journey with a diagnosis of diabetes in 2014, and after initially being placed on insulin at diagnosis, he managed to essentially reverse his diabetes and now maintains normal blood sugars on no medication. He's also a keen cyclist, a family man, and he's very impressive with his cycling. I know this personally, but his favorite activity is a 30-mile bike ride home at the end of an all-day operating list on a Friday to enjoy dinner with his wife and 4 children, and then fall asleep in front of a family movie with ice cream, of course. So thanks very much, Koye, for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Great. And the topic today is just a summary, really. Is From Insulin to Nothing, an NHS Consultant's personal experience of reversing diabetes. Hopefully we'll touch on different areas like diet, maybe even exercise and sleep, and just general lifestyle advice. So, Koye, I want to just dive straight in, if that's all right. So, you were diagnosed with diabetes in 2014. Going back before that, can you just give us an idea of what your lifestyle was like in terms of what you were eating? Were you exercising much, and how things were before you were diagnosed?
So reflecting back on I'd had a journey up until the point of diagnosis, which, now looking back on, a lot of things now made sense. So before that, I was sort of an average kind of guy. I was always a larger guy, basically. And that was, I knew I had that tendency to put on weight quite easily. I did watch my weight, watch what I ate, went to the gym 4 times a week, that kind of stuff. Basically, I played a lot of sports as well when I was younger at school. I was always a bigger guy. I was a prop at our version of rugby at school. But I didn't pay any particular sort of attention the way I do now, which hopefully will become a bit more apparent as we talk. At the time, I exercised. I kept my weight at what I felt was an acceptable level. I ate reasonably well, but not particularly carefully. And as I said, I go to the gym 4 times a week, exercise fairly regularly. Yeah. But I always knew there was that tendency to put on weight, which makes sense now, and I was always cautious of it. So that made me, I wouldn't go overboard with things, but at the same time, I wasn't, super duper careful. Just to give you an idea, I'd always weighed about 100 and something kilos from when I can remember when I'd been, wondering. I'm about 6 foot tall, and I was about 102, 103 kilos then.
Yeah.
But for me, that was a fairly stable weight. I was reasonably happy with that. I was reasonably muscular as well. So how we all tell ourselves, it's mostly muscle. Especially as a younger man, I was like, it's mostly muscle because I go to the gym. Yeah. But that put my BMI probably in the overweight, if not tending towards obese range. But again, we're always told don't feature too much on BMI, and something I will hopefully touch on a bit later on is it is right not to focus too much on the BMI. It's a surrogate marker and just an indicator.
Yeah.
So I did all that, and then I grew up a bit more. I had my first kid. Went through orthopedic training. Had my first son when I was towards the end of my registrar training.
Yeah.
And then life changed. Didn't get the chance to go to the gym 4 times a week anymore because you've now got a baby at home. And I had to make a few modifications. And then I noticed I was just putting on weight. And I think just stopping exercising just meant, I didn't think I changed my eating by much. And I probably wasn't sleeping quite as well. But it just, and I couldn't explain the weight gain. There wasn't a lot.
There's that change in your family circumstances, and you couldn't get to the gym as much, and that just inevitably led to a little bit of weight gain. But you were saying your diet was pretty much the same. You weren't really.
I don't think I'd really changed very much about it. So I just thought it's the lack of exercise that's causing it, And I thought, right, I need to start doing something different now. So there was a moment in towards the end of Christmas. I'm trying to remember which year it would have been. It would be Christmas 2011, probably. Maybe 2010. I think it was 2010 because that's when my son was born, and we went out to Nigeria when I have a lot of family there. That's where I'm originally from. We went there for the Christmas holidays, and I stayed with my sister, and they sort of live on a beach style estate, and I'd get up in the mornings and I'd take my brother-in-law's bicycle and I'd just sort of do a little loop around the estate, a little 5 mile loop around, and it was fun. I used to enjoy it. It was actually something I enjoyed doing. And then I noticed that after that, when I came back and Christmas, I always factored in, you always put on Christmas weight. That was always, part of the deal. Then you came back and then you have your January. So people call, whatever you do in January, you hit the gym, you go more often than normal and that kind of thing, you lose the weight. And that for me was always a cycle. And then I came back and I was like, I didn't put on weight this Christmas. Weight, I'm thinking, oh, that's a bit odd. I was eating like I normally would at Christmas. I eat quite a lot, and I didn't seem to have put on weight. So I thought, interesting. I wonder if the cycling had anything to do with it.
Yeah.
And at that time, I'd actually decided, when I get back to England, I am going to buy a bike because, I live just off a cycle track here. So I thought, well, I'll get a bike. And, at the time, I just thought at the weekends, if I'll just take an hour in the morning, just go up and down the cycle path, that's do that kind of exercise if I can't get to the gym. So I came back. I was working at the Bristol Royal Infirmary at the time. I bought a hybrid bike on the cycle to work scheme. And, on a Saturday morning, I took the bike and I thought, well, I'll cycle towards work. Now, the other story behind this was whilst working at the BRI, it's your classic city centre hospital, as you know, no parking, so I'd wake up in the morning, it would take me on a day without traffic, it would take about 35 minutes to get there. It never took that long. It was more like, 50 minutes, an hour by the time you then factored in the traffic. And then you spend another 15 minutes driving around looking for a parking spot. So you can imagine the stress of that in the mornings, really. So I cycled in that morning and it took me 28 minutes. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. If I do this every day, I can get up later, so I have a bit more sleep. I can get to work predictably. And then they just built this fancy new cycle park with showers and all that kind of thing. So I can come in, have a shower. So I thought the following Monday, I thought I'm going to give it a try. So I cycled into work and lo and behold, I was in, showered, changed, no stress, in the trauma meeting. So now going, wow, what am I going to do with now this 20 minutes that I've got now? So that became a bit of a no-brainer for me. So I started cycling into work. But then I noticed something. My weight started to come down.
Right.
Now at this stage, I had started to diet quite intensively. I remember I used to joke. So my lunch would be like a sandwich and a carrot.
Right.
And my wife would wake up and scrape my carrot for me, and put it in. And I was working. One of my boss at the time used to go, oh, let's go with the scraped carrot again. So I was now paying a lot more attention to my diet because I'd realized that, if I didn't, I'd put on the weight. And my weight started to come down with paying attention to the diet. It was very rapid weight loss though, with the cycling. So in a period of about 6 months, at this stage, my weight had gone up. I mean, I think at my heaviest, I was weighing up to 115 kilos. Right. So I put about 10 kilos and that was quite a lot. And, I think I might have gone up even a bit above that because you get to say weight is a very complex and I get to sit where I think I'm not even going to measure this anymore because it's far too depressing. I just don't want to know. So I suspect I weighed a little bit above that, but my last measured weight was about 115. And then suddenly the next 9 years, I was 110. I was back down to 105. This all happened within the space of about 6 months. Right. And all I was doing was just doing this. And the cycle ride, it's only 6 miles. So I was doing 12 miles a day of that kind of cycling, basically.
So just that little bit of cycling makes such a big impact.
It seemed to have a huge impact, yeah.
And when you, coming up to when you were diagnosed with diabetes, what sort of symptoms did you have? Was there something that made alerted you to the fact that you could have diabetes?
Nothing at all.
Right.
At the time,
Yeah.
but with hindsight, so there was the weight loss, which you'll see in a minute will factor in. And then so I moved, as you know, with registrar rotations, you move from hospitals. And so my next job was in Bath. Now,
Mm.
where I live on the cycle path is between Bristol and Bath. So, you know, I come out 10 left to 6 miles down the road, I'm at the BRI. Come out 10 right, 10 miles down the road, I'm at the RUH, which was, you know, just perfect location in Bath.
Mm.
So my bike ride then went up
Mm.
to 20 miles a day, you know, 10 miles each. And I was doing that every day, basically, mainly on the cycle path. And my weight continued to come down. So at this stage, in the first 6 months, I lost about 20 kilos in total.
Mm.
And
Wow.
by the end of the year, I'd lost, you know, a lot more. Now, for me, that was because I was trying to lose the weight. So that was a panacea. I had found the magic cure. You
Yeah.
know, naturally, my wife was, she at one point said, "You are losing weight quite quickly." You
Yeah.
know,
She's worried.
she was getting
Mm.
worried, and I was like, no, 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 this is it, this is a deal. Now then I thought to myself, when I got into a certain weight where I thought actually that's probably about normal, probably about okay for me. So that was, I think it was about 88 kilos, 87, 88
Right.
kilos at this stage, you know.
Yeah.
I thought, you know what, I'll just start eating, you know, normally or even eat more. So, and that was the other thing. I had quite a voracious appetite. You know, I was
Mm.
eating lots, but actually I was okay because I was still losing the weight. So for me, I had found the perfect diet.
Mm.
You know, as long as I was cycling, I could eat whatever I wanted and not put
Mm.
on weight, and in fact keep losing weight.
Mm.
So I did that for a bit. But one thing I did notice was I was drinking a lot of water.
Right.
I was getting up to pee quite a lot at night, but that was because I was drinking a lot of water. And I was also quite tired actually by the end of the week. By the time I
Mm.
got to Friday, I was just exhausted. But then you see all of this fitted into the cycling. You know, I was cycling 20 miles a day every day,
Yeah.
100 miles a week. You know, drinking water is just because you're dehydrated, because you're exercising lots.
Mm.
Peeing lots is because you're drinking lots of water. Everything seemed to fit the picture.
Right. Yeah.
So
But just for our viewers, those are types of symptoms to look out for, aren't they?
they are indeed.
If you're thinking of diabetes,
Yeah.
drinking lots, going to the toilet a lot, and
Yeah.
feeling tired, and these types of things.
Yeah.
Now, can you tell us about the time when you were diagnosed? How did it happen, and how did you feel and respond to
Mm.
that?
So it was an incidental finding. I was, as you know, we all go off for fellowship when it comes towards the end of your training. So I was coming up towards the end of my training. I was due to go off to Australia to do my fellowship. And as part of that, you had to do a medical.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of my medical, they had to dip my urine.
Right.
And I remember that very day. I went to see the GP. It was a guy in somewhere in Cardiff because they have particular certified doctors that did certain things for you, basically, as
Mm.
part of the visa application process and the work permit. So, yeah, and he dipped and goes, "You've got quite a lot of sugar in your urine." And
Right.
I went, now just give you to put things in context at this stage, my lifestyle had stabilized. The other thing was I'd also found, so with cycling, I got heavily into it.
Mm.
So I bought another couple of bikes, bought a carbon road bike. I
Mm-hmm.
started entering into not competition, but cycling sportives where, you know, you do 100-mile rides in a day, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff, basically. And as part of sort of the nutrition and all of that, you know, you have all these sugary gels and stuff that you told to use to fuel your body cells,
Yeah.
consuming quite a lot of those as part of my training, basically. Like that was just normal, you know, cyclist training stuff. My weight had come right down to 86. So for the first time in my life, I was a BMI of 24, which I'd never been my whole life, you know, but, you know, I was in a steady place. I
Yeah.
was good. It seemed to sort of normalize at about 86 kilos, you know, and I was, you know, quite happy. And so the guy dissed my urine and says, "You got quite a lot of sugar in your urine." And I went, "Well, that's not possible." And immediately, alarm bells went off in my head. And I thought, I can't be diabetic, you
Mm.
know? So he went, and for me, you know, I was at the height of my fitness as well. My cycling had gone,
Mm.
you know, I was doing, you know, times that I never believed I could do on the bike. Do you know when you're at that stage, I feel
Yeah.
physically fit and physically healthy? Okay, a bit tired all the time, but, you know,
Yeah.
that's just because I'm training loads, but I'm quite happy with that. So it then referred me to my GP practice. They did my blood sugar, did my HbA1c, which we'll talk about in a minute, a marker of
Mm-hmm.
diabetes. And lo and behold, it turned out I was diabetic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, there was a lot of confusion at this stage, Omar, because, you know, everybody kind of went, well, hang on, you're losing weight. And we have that traditional belief is diabetes is a disease of weight gain, and we'll touch on that in a minute. You know, so you're diabetic because you're overweight.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you lose the weight, you reverse diabetes.
Mm.
And whereas elements of that are true, we've actually missed the way the link works. And I'll touch on that because obviously you can tell I've then gone and done the research on this.
Yep.
I think I can now explain why a lot of the things that happened to me did happen at the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then they were like, well, could you be a type 1 diabetic? Could you be a type 2 diabetic? I was working, now at this stage, I had moved to Southmead Hospital. That was my last, I was in my initial part of my fellowship there.
Mm.
And I was working with well, obviously I know an endocrinologist there who basically saw me, did the test and said, it's indeterminate because the way your symptoms and your diagnosis has evolved would be more consistent with the type 1. You know, could have been maturity onset diabetes of the young. You know, he looked at me and he said, well, you know, your BMI is 24, so you're not overweight. So I can't tell you to lose weight to cure your diabetes.
Mm.
You know, my blood sugars were, at the time, my fasting blood glucose was 16 millimoles per liter. So for the readers, for the listeners, anywhere between, I mean, we say a fasting glucose of greater than 7.7, I think is still one of the criteria now, but essentially less than 7 is what you want. And I was running at 16. My HbA1c, which is a marker of your long-term glucose level, was 126. So less than 42 is normal. Between 42 and 48 is pre-diabetes, and above 48 is diabetes. And I was running at 126. So I was, you know, I was not only diabetic, but I'd been running high sugars for a while, it looked like. So there was a lot of confusion around the time. A lot of things didn't make sense, which subsequently ended up making sense.
Yeah. Now, diabetes, obviously, because from our background as doctors, we know how bad a disease diabetes is. Sometimes for the general public, they see it as a disease where the blood sugars are high and need monitoring over time, but maybe they're not so aware of what things it can lead on to. So could you, for the viewers, just explain why diabetes is such a bad disease? What sort of things can happen with diabetes?
So diabetes in itself, it just means high blood sugar, basically. However, sugar is toxic to our blood. So the body has mechanisms for dealing with sugar. So when we eat foods, especially with carbohydrates in them, we will tend to actually have a spike in our blood sugar, which the body works very hard to counteract, basically. So the effects of the high blood sugars are the things that we do notice. So we know it causes heart problems, cardiac problems. We know it can cause blindness if the sugars basically cause I wouldn't say glycation. I'm trying to not to use a technical term there, but essentially it can cause small vessel diseases that can cause blindness, kidney problems, can lead to amputations because you're not getting the adequate blood supply to your limbs and peripheries, and can lead to loss of sensation in your nerves. All of these are due to high blood sugar levels that then have effects on other proteins and, you know, other molecules and structures in your body, basically.
Yeah, and I have some statistics from Diabetes UK actually, and every week diabetes in the UK leads to 184 amputations, more than 770 strokes, 590 heart attacks, and 2,300 cases of heart failure, and that's every week. So as you've rightly explained, really the significant problems that it can lead to, we're not always aware of that, but that's one of the reasons why it's really important to prevent, but also to manage if you do have diabetes.
Absolutely.
So after you received the diagnosis and things, what changes did you make to your diet, and also were you put on a lot of medications at the time?
So as you can imagine, that I'd said this was just before I went off on fellowship, basically. So I was doing my medical. You know, the dates always stick with you. It was in May. I was just starting my fellowship in July, so that was a few weeks before I went off. And by the time we'd done all the tests, seen an endocrinologist, done everything, it was pretty much time to go. I remember that I saw him the week before I was due to fly out to Australia, and he said, you know, at the end of the day, your sugars are very high. Dietary modifications and exercise now. You're exercising a lot, so I'm not going to ask you to do any more exercise. You're not, you know, you're not overweight, because at that point in time I actually wasn't even, I was in the normal BMI spectrum. So I ask you to lose weight. we can try you on things like metformin and the medication, but my inclination is to get you straight onto insulin. I sort of just went, whoa, that was quite a big hit, really. So I said, well, can I at least try the metformin for a week, and just see what my blood sugars do in that week? So I did that, used metformin, didn't really get my blood sugars low enough. And literally the day before I was due to fly out, I went and saw him, got issued my insulin pen, got given my insulin doses, got some instructions on, how to dose and titrate, and got told when he gets to Australia, register with the GP pretty much straight away and find yourself an endocrinologist, which is what I did. So I went straight onto that. And then I got to Oz. And now I'd said to myself at this stage, seeing that cycling was my panacea to everything, I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to cycle this thing away. I'm sure if I exercise loads, I'm sure I can drive my blood sugars down. I'm sure I can. So I was still keen, even though I started the insulin, to come off the insulin. So when I got there, I spoke to my boss for my fellowship. He introduced me to an endocrinologist out there who was a very nice guy. Took me on board straight away, and I explained exactly what I was doing and what I wanted to do to achieve this. I joined a cycling club out there as well. Again, my boss introduced me to a friend of his who cycled loads. So I'd get up every morning. We do a quicker loop, 1 hour bike ride around the city. Have coffee in the morning in Subiaco, which is a nice part of Perth, and then head off to work and be in work by 7:30 in the morning, really. So it was a 5:30 rise and cycle, basically, with coffee, and then start work. So I did that. I was on insulin at the time. Managed to get my sugars down, but guess what I noticed? My weight starts to go up. Okay, that's fine. I just need to cycle more. And if I did loads more cycling, my weight will stabilize. And again, I end up with that same problem of my weight was just going up again. It didn't matter how much exercise I was doing, how much I was watching when I ate, my weight just kept going up again. So I went back and saw my endocrinologist, said, bit down, and I said, is there any way I can come off the insulin? Now, he did some extra tests, and he said, look, I know your diagnosis is uncertain, but there is still evidence of pancreatic function, and there are all these other tests that you can do to look for it. So we can try you on a medication that will boost your own pancreas function, and that way you might be able to come off the insulin. So I went on to something called Byetta, liraglutide. Now, this may now ring a bell with listeners, because what is currently popular on the market now, becoming popular, is semaglutide as a weight loss drug. And I'm sure people would have heard about this. So liraglutide was a type of medication like that. I was using the injectable version of it, basically, but it wasn't insulin. So I started using that, and the weight gain slowed down. It didn't stop, but it slowed down. And I noticed that, and I thought, okay, this seems to be doing the job. At least I'm not taking insulin, because obviously everybody knows insulin makes you put on weight. That's just, So I stayed on that whilst all through my time in Australia. I made what I thought were the right lifestyle modifications. So I was always very controlled with my diet, what I ate, but I just did the usual calorie counting thing, made sure I was, getting enough exercise. So I'd go out with a cycling club, 3-4 days a week at the very least, and yeah, my weight, it went up and stabilized at about 93, 94 kilos. And I sort of stayed at that. And then, now the bit I can't remember is whether it was whilst I was still out there when I came back to the UK, I then asked the question, could I go on to something else? Could I just kind of step down my medication? So to cut the long story short, I went on to linagliptin, which is another type of medication that essentially they all work via slightly different mechanisms, but the end game here is to boost your own pancreas's insulin production, basically, amongst other mechanisms. So I used that for this. At this stage, my HbA1c had come right down to about 40, in the 40s. So I was in the normal range, basically. And that was in case of our sugars were well controlled. And I stayed like that for a little while. Again, weight normalized at about 93, 94 kilos. Blood sugars well controlled. I'm on the tablets. This is it for life. I was fairly accepting of that. Obviously, I was still doing things like going for my regular eye checks, renal function tests, my blood cholesterol. Now, the good news, obviously, is my cholesterol was always on the low end of normal.
Right.
So one of the things I was offered at diagnosis based on the research was that actually by going on a statin to lower your cholesterol, even if your cholesterol was normal, and going on a blood pressure medication, even if your blood pressure was either in the normal range or high to normal. Now, one thing I must say, Omar, here at this point is whenever I talk about this, I always tell people I'm not a diabetes doctor, but I'm a doctor with lived experience of diabetes.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't take anything I say as gospel, and I'd encourage people to go and look up their own facts and things, basically. But I did a lot of the research based on my knowledge of endocrinology, obviously treating a lot of my patients do have diabetes, so I need to have an understanding of the condition so I can manage their orthopedic problems. But I actually did a lot of reading around the subject, including primary research papers, books by people like Michael Mosley, and which I'll touch on in a bit, around managing diabetes and managing weight in general and diet. So I had done all the modifications I felt were appropriate at the time, and everything has stabilized. However, about I think it must have been just before the pandemic, I noticed my A1C starts to creep up again. So it goes up to, I think, about 44, 45, which is the pre-diabetes range. Now, I changed nothing at this stage. I was fairly stable. And then it hit 50, which is back in the diabetes range. And I'm like, something ain't right here. I'm doing nothing different. Now, at the point when I'd come back and I was off the insulin, I was having a chat with one of our local endocrinologists here. And I said to them, I said, gosh, insulin was horrible. It made me put on weight. I felt awful. I never want to go back onto it again. And I remember she said to me, you do know that 50% of diabetes, of type 2 diabetics, are on insulin by about 10 years of diagnosis. And I went, whoa. Now, at this stage, we'd now come to the conclusion that I was probably a type 2, but just a weird, strange type of type 2 because I didn't fit the typical pattern, but I was the type 2. And I think now I know definitely I was always a type 2. I was never a type 1. And again, it's the other thing I always say to people because I've had a couple of people I know who, like me, have been diagnosed in maturity and not particularly overweight, and did not fit the pattern, and they've been told you're probably type 1 diabetic. And I've always said, you need to go back and just question that diagnosis, actually, and do a little bit more. So that was the point where, one of the big game changers for me. So I went and read Michael Mosley's book, the 8-week blood sugar diet, I think it was called, something like that. And he talked about the benefits of rapid weight loss on diabetics, basically, or on people with diabetes. And it was around people who had either had bariatric surgery or had just done it on their own by just losing weight and by different means. And also talks about how we all seem to have what's called a personal fat threshold. So again, that it's not just about your body fat and your subcutaneous fat, it's all around your visceral fat as well. So Michael Mosley himself, if you read his book, it tells you he was a skinny medical student. He's a doctor who now does a lot of TV documentaries. He was a skinny medical student, became a normal sized person, i.e. he wasn't skinny anymore, and developed type 2 diabetes with a family history of it. So your BMI is not the be all and end all. You could have a normal BMI and still be, type 2 diabetes. So at that point, I thought, well, what if I just decided to go on this blood sugar diet, this 8-week blood sugar diet, and lose 10% of my body weight, which was roughly 9 kilos. So if I drop my weight down to about 83, 84, would that cure the diabetes? Or would that reverse my or what we'll call insulin resistance, which I'll touch on in a minute. All of this I subsequently discovered after that initial experiment. So I did that. I did the 8-week blood sugar diet. I did lose all the weight because the way I did it was to go on his intermittent fasting thing, or not intermittent fast, sorry, calorie control, where you're eating basically 800 calories a day. And I would do that every single day, which was virtually nothing. And when I first started, I remember just being hungry, literally hungry all the time, but thinking, I was absolutely determined that I had to do this. But not only was I just consuming the 800 calories, I was still doing a lot of cycling. So I was burning on average about 1,000 calories a day on just commuting to work cycling. So I knew I was always in a calorie deficit. And of course, the weight, in fact, I lost the 10 kilos probably in the first 3-4 weeks, and the weight came down. And then I watched. Now, the other thing I did at this stage was to get a blood sugar monitor, a continuous glucose monitoring device rather than the finger prick one, which was, again, for me, a big game changer. And I'll talk a bit about that as well. But I could see what my sugars were doing, and they were, always low, and they stayed. My sugar curve was completely flat because A, I wasn't consuming very much food, but B, I wasn't consuming very much carbohydrate, which is what I'll come and talk about the effects that has on your insulin levels and things. So sugars, went right down. etc. However, so I did that. I remember I did it just for my birthday in April, and I had my parameters checked again in September, and my A1C was still about 50.
Right.
So, which meant, either I hadn't given enough time to work or something was very different. So, I read a lot of other books. Roy Taylor's book, again, around he's an endocrinologist who works in, I believe, Newcastle. But he's written a book about rapid weight loss and diabetes control. And then starting to get into the whole low carb keto sphere and learning about low carb diets. So I thought, what is this keto thing? Let me give it a try. So I decided, okay, and that was back September, October. I went on the keto diet. And I did that over the Christmas period. And I imagine trying to be a keto diet over Christmas. Now, one thing I haven't told you about myself, Omar, is I'm a total sweet tooth, which again fits in with my,
like me,
so I mean, it's just, bring me the sweets, the chocolates. I love that stuff, Carbohydrates I absolutely love. I love my rice, love my bread, love my pasta. So imagine giving all of that up, and living on a diet. It was a massive change, and I think I was uncertain about the influence it would have on things like my blood cholesterol. Now, as I said, my cholesterol had always been, in fact, I was always on the low end of normal. So when I took my cholesterol, it would read abnormal, but because it would be abnormal because I think for triglycerides, your range was, now don't quote me on these figures because I need to go and look them up again. But let's just say for explanation's sake, it's 1.4 to 1.8, and mine was about 1.3. So it was just below the low end. So those parameters were fine. I worried that, if I went on this essentially low carbohydrate but quite high fat diet, that would make my blood lipids go up. So anyway, I did that, and then I'd arranged to have tests in April of the following year to just see, where I was basically. Now, at this stage, I'd noticed that my sugars were now significantly quite low. In fact, the glucose monitor I used to wear at the time had an alarm if your blood sugars dropped below, I think it was 3.9, and often mine would alarm. But you see, again, because I spent a lot of time studying myself, I knew that hypoglycemia, because I wasn't on any medication. I should have mentioned that. So I stopped my medication at the time when I also started the blood sugar thing, because I wanted to see basically, could I do this without any meds? So gave up all of my meds and just measured my sugars. And I figured as long as my sugars were in the normal range, I didn't have to worry about taking the meds, and they did normalize. But I think what I hadn't realized at the time was I was getting spikes and lows. So even though my average was normal, I was getting the highs and then the lows. And that probably was why my A1C wasn't coming down. Cut the long story short, went on keto diet for a few months. And by April, when I had my sugars checked, my A1C was 36.
Wow.
On no medication.
Yeah.
And I just thought, this is it. I've had a lot of those moments. This is it. This is all I need to do now, basically. Just stay on keto, for the rest of my life. And actually, I'd gone to a stage where I could sort of tolerate it. I'd found, you can buy cookbooks. You can get sugar alternatives for one thing. So I started using things like erythritol and stevia, which were natural sugar substitutes. Because, as we know, the artificial ones, the sucralose, aspartame, they all have health warnings that come associated with them. Everybody worries about them. But the natural ones are fine. I got into keto baking. I could make keto cookies with like almond flour and dark chocolate. Again, there was that whole adventure, basically.
Yeah.
And A1C normalizes. I maintained that for a bit. And then came your normal physiology. And this is a bit where I tell people your normal physiology always comes back to haunt you. The sugar cravings, I just want a piece of bread. I haven't, I love bananas. Bananas were my main form of fueling with cycling. And for a whole year, I didn't have a single banana.
It doesn't sound like a very fun period going through this.
It wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, I found a way to convince myself it was all right. Because the great thing with keto, actually, is you're never hungry. Honestly, your body starts to work off the keto. So that drive, the hunger drive, almost pretty much goes away. So that kind of goes away, which is fine. But what I did find was certain foods that I used to enjoy, I would crave, And for a long time, I just said, I just want to eat one banana, I used to eat at least one banana a day, and for a whole year, I hadn't had a single banana. So I'd be like, I'd really crave it. And no matter there wasn't a matter of cashew nuts or almonds I could eat that would, satisfy that craving. I just wanted a banana.
Yeah. And then, so you sort of from what you've spoken to me about previously, you ended up towards finding out a bit more about what your body can deal with and what it can't deal with.
Yeah.
So can you now come on to that and how you manage things now?
So I went on to, I did a lot of studying, a research study with an N of one, basically. And it was understanding my own body. From what I understood of, basic physiology, I used quite a lot of tools. So the things I did, I used, I for a while, I got a continuous glucose monitor. They are actually quite expensive to use. And I couldn't get that on prescription on the
How
NHS.
much are they? Do you know roughly?
So it's £50 basically.
Right.
And each one love for just for the sensor. Now these days you can buy just the sensor and it'll work with a standard iPhone. And you can just scan it with your iPhone. The sensor was £50. At the time when I got it, you couldn't do that. And you had to buy the whole thing. So you could get a pack for £150, which included, I think, 2 sensors and a reader. But now you just need to buy the sensor. And in fact, I know Abbott were doing a thing where they were offering them a trial, a 2-week trial for free. I don't know if they're still offering that. So it's £50 every 2 weeks. But I went through a 3-month period of just thought, it's £100 a month, but actually this is money I've got to invest in my own health. And I said to myself, well, people pay that in gym memberships actually, and I haven't got a gym membership now. So I could justify it based on those grounds. So I had a continuous glucose monitor that I wore all the time. I used my Fitness Pal to log, and I literally used to weigh my food and log everything I ate. So I could log exactly how much calories I was consuming, but actually more importantly, further down the line, how much carbohydrates I was consuming. And I started to find out what was my personal carbohydrate threshold. So how much carb would I need to eat in a meal to spike my blood sugar? Because I knew that was what I needed to control. And and then I learned carbs were very different. I mean, I've learned so many different things. What I do before I eat the meal, how stressed I am when I'm eating the meal, how much sleep I'd had, all had an effect on what my blood sugars did after the meal. But I noticed, I'll never forget one thing that struck me. One of my experiments, I had checked my sugars, and I think at that stage I didn't even have the continuous monitor, and I was using the finger prick test. It was 5.4 normal. I had 1 piece of white bread with butter, no marmalade, because I wanted to see what effect that would have on there without anything sweet on there. And my sugars shot right up to 12.7, I think it was, and I thought, gosh, and I love white bread. But for me, I was just like, right, so this stuff can't be that good for me. Now, obviously, there were other things that probably came into play then that I probably didn't understand at the time, and I do now. But essentially, there was a period of intensive study, and I actually collected all the data. And I've always said, if anybody wants to do a research study with an N of one, I've got data on exactly, what my blood sugars did, what I was eating. Also, I wear, a Garmin watch, which monitors your, essentially your heart rate variability, your sleep. Was the other thing I started to notice, my sugars would depend on how much REM sleep I'd had at night and how much deep sleep and how well I'd slept would affect my morning blood sugars. Right. I have a power meter on my bike, so I could work out exactly almost to 5% accuracy at the power meter to tell you how many calories I burnt on each bike ride. So it wasn't guessing based on your heart rate; it was giving you an actual. So I could collect data on my rest, on my nutrition, on my exercise, and work out and my weight. I weigh myself daily. I still do, and I always caution people about doing that because obviously I'm not looking to trigger anybody to get an eating disorder or something like that. But actually, for me, it was just a good way of telling what the immediate effect of what I was eating, doing would then have on things like weight and blood. Because don't forget, weight isn't just about your actual body fat and body weight; it's also your body water composition. And those sorts of things. And we know carbohydrates go with water. So if you start fasting, you lose weight very quickly because all that weight is water. Because you deplete your glycogen stores in your muscles and your liver, and the water goes away with it. But for me, it was just a way of actually monitoring, all these different things. And I'll notice things like, for example, I could have a relatively lower calorie meal, but because there was a lot of carbohydrate in it, when I weighed myself the following morning, my weight had gone up by quite a bit.
Right.
And conversely, I could have what I would consider a fairly high calorie meal, but it was very low carb, it was mainly protein and fat. And I weighed myself the following morning, and my weight had either gone down or stayed the same. And I'd be like, but it really did help me, piece things together.
So just to bring in a question, because we we did ask the public as well if they had any questions to put forward to you. I think now is probably a good time. So it fits with what we're discussing at the moment about the keto diet or personal response. So we've got a question asking, will high protein, very low carb and low fat work just as well as the keto diet? Or is it better to eat as usual, but check your own response to different carb foods and take from there?
Absolutely. They've totally nailed that one. We're all so different, Omar. And this is what I keep telling everybody. What works for me may not work for you at all. Yep. My response to white bread may not affect you in the same way at all. You may have a different response. We have certain basic tenets to go with. And I think the key things I would stress, and I think it's a good point to bring this in now, is you need to question what the orthodox thinking is, basically. And there are a few mythbusters for me out there. The number one is we say people become diabetic because they're fat, basically, and they've got, they're overweight and got too much body fat. And actually, I think we've missed the causal link there. And if people actually now agree with this, you have a tendency to put on weight because you have a predisposition to insulin resistance. And it's that insulin resistance on the diabetic spectrum that causes weight gain. That's why I always notice I put on weight fairly easily before I even got diagnosed with diabetes. And a lot of people are like that. Now, so even though what you're measuring, we measure blood sugar, right? Now, I have a normal blood sugar, but what I've not measured is what my insulin levels are. And it's, my pancreas could be working quite hard, producing a lot of insulin to keep those blood sugars normal.
Yep.
And we always see people with type 2 diabetes, there's a whole lifelong process, which is why it's adult onset. Because when it starts off, your body copes with it. It just says, okay, that's fine. You're quite insulin resistant. Yeah. And I think it might be worth me just explaining that or my difference in type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So type 1, essentially, is traditionally your body can't produce enough insulin. So rather your pancreas can't produce enough insulin because there's a primary deficiency in the pancreas itself. And that's for a number of reasons, basically. And therefore, whenever you consume sugars, there isn't the insulin to help drive the sugar into your cells and keep your blood sugars normal.
Yep.
With type 2, your body is actually insulin resistant. So your fat cells, your muscles normally would take up the sugars as you consume them, but they require a lot more insulin to drive those sugars into the cells. So the sugars then stay in your blood. So actually, what people say is people who develop the adult onset have had a lifelong of high insulin levels because they need to maintain their sugars at a normal level. And eventually the pancreas just kind of goes, I can't keep up with this, I give up. And then they tip into pre-diabetes and then into diabetes. Yeah. That's why it's adult onset. So the key thing here is driving down your insulin resistance, which is where the low carbohydrate thing comes in, and knowing what your own carbohydrate threshold, comes in as well. The reason why you put on weight is that insulin is an anti-lipolytic, so it stops you from burning your own fat. So you can think of it in this way, and this is not my analogy, I've heard other people use it, is you go to supermarkets and you stock up on food, basically, and you buy all this food and you come home, you put loads of it in the fridge, and you eat what you need to eat at the time. Now you've eaten, it's time for your next meal. However, the fridge is locked. You can't get access to it. So you have to go back to the supermarket. You buy more food. You always buy in excess of what you're going to eat at the time. You come back, you can get food in the fridge, but you can't take it out. So you keep storing the food in the fridge, but you can't ever take any of it out. And all that happens, and you can think about it, I mean, being my sweet tooth, my tradition was my breakfast was always crunching out cornflakes. I loved it, packed full of sugar. I'd wake up, have that for breakfast, and then I would get to, about 10 o'clock and I'm starving. And I'm thinking, how could I have burnt all that energy that I had? And it's classic high insulin levels. You store up all the excess calories and sugar in your fat cells. But when it's time for your body to now get more energy, it's saying, well, I can't access the store. So it chucks out all your ghrelins and all your hunger hormones and makes you eat more. So basically, you need to keep your insulin and sugar levels down. And you need to work out what your own personal carbohydrate threshold is, basically. And I think the reality is everybody needs to do some experimentation on themselves. And I've done it probably to an extreme here, where I've kind of been using gadgets and, using apps and that kind of thing. But you can do very simple things, just work out what works for you. So I've given a very long-winded answer to that question. The short answer is yes. The only caveat I would give there is, and this is again slightly going against orthodox training, we've always said, we've always feared fat. And so the person that especially said, high protein, low carb, yes. Low fat, I'm not so convinced about, because I actually now encourage people. So I've gone from drinking semi-skim milk, I drink full fat milk now. I don't fear fat. And somebody, I think it was Benjamin Bickman, who's one of the guys in the low carb, in this sort of circuit, basically. And he uses an acronym which I quite like. He says, control your carbs, prioritize protein, which is what your person is suggesting, don't fear fat. Because fat keeps you full, actually. And fat, you're less likely to consume as much if you're eating fat in your diet. As long as you're having healthy fats in a reasonable amount, you're controlling your carbohydrates. And you know what? What we've never proven is a link between high blood cholesterol, high blood fats, and fat consumption. Right. But what we have proven is a link between high carbohydrate consumption and high blood cholesterol.
Right. Okay. So that's really well answered. I think just last few minutes, I wanted to ask specifically about the costs involved with eating healthily. Is there anything that people can do? Because now, whenever we go to the supermarkets, a lot of food there is unhealthy, and the healthy stuff is expensive. What sort of tips would you give for people who are thinking to eat healthy but are worried about the cost?
Yeah. So Omar, it's a big one actually. That's part of why I want to do this, because a lot of people are affected by this, people who can't afford to sort of do the healthy eating bits. And I think it does create a massive social inequity, actually, in terms of how we manage our lifestyles. So you are absolutely right. I went from eating normal sugar to using erythritol, for example. Erythritol costs, I think, is about £7 per kilo if you buy it on Amazon, whereas you can buy a kilo of sugar for less than £1.
Yeah.
Just to give you, like for like, if you were to go down that route. The other thing is also ultra processed foods, which I haven't touched on at all, but they've got a lot to answer for. So, for example, when I was on keto, I was eating, I think to myself, okay, I'll have a sausage or a burger, or actually the classic one was I used to have like this bowl of prawns and put mixed vegetables inside it. And then I bought this spice that I just thought was a mixed spice. I'd use there as a sort of salting agent. I never read the label. And I went back and looked at the label. And guess what the first ingredient of my spice was? Sugar. Right. They put sugar in spices. So tips, always read the label. Yeah. It will seem to be more expensive initially because ultra-processed foods are there for a reason. They're super cheap. Basically, it's the easiest thing to grab a hold of. And there are people who believe in conspiracy theories of, they've made the foods deliberately hyper-palatable so you don't know when you're full. And to be honest, there is an element of that because there's certain things I eat that I just think it's so nice. I can just keep eating it. And even when your stomach feels full, you think, I just want a bit more because it tastes so nice. And there's the issue around the dopamine receptors in the brain, that kind of thing. Whereas normal foods, I eat a lot of nuts, I eat a lot of almonds. And you know what? If I'm hungry, I feel like snacking, I enjoy the almonds, but I get to a point where I think, I've had enough. And I don't think about food anymore. So not anything that's as close to the source, to the farm, to nature as possible, the better. It comes at a cost, and that's something that as a society we all need to address, because it's easy to chuck out a lot of ultra-processed cheap foods out there that we know are harming people from all these effects. Now, to have whole foods, out there. But what I would say is go for as whole food as you can. Buy your meat from the butchers with the fat on it. Eat the meat with the fat. Go for grass-fed cattle if you can. Go for corn-fed chickens if you can. Go for as near to organic as possible. There is a slight increase in the cost, but I just think this is your own health you're looking at here. So one has to think about that. But there's no doubt in my mind, it does cost more. And I think as a society is what we need to address. But I think step one is just making people understand that just because food is cheap and it tastes nice doesn't mean it's good for you.
No, that's great advice. I think we'll end there. That's been really, really interesting, and thanks a lot for coming, Koye. We're very grateful.
My pleasure.
We'll be putting the podcast out on YouTube soon, and hopefully having some more. But for the first podcast, I thought we had some really good discussions there, and I'm sure our audience will love it. So thanks very much. And
thank you, Mark. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. As you can probably tell, it's something I really enjoy talking about. And I always joke that's one of my consultations in hospital. You start off, someone coming for a hip or knee replacement, and you spend 5 minutes telling them about how you've got to lose some weight to make it safe, and then at 20 minutes talking about how they can lose the weight. So I do enjoy talking about it because I've learned a lot about it myself, and there's so much more that I haven't even touched upon in this podcast.
Yeah. Amazingly, we got through a lot, but I'm sure we could have carried on. It was we had so much more to discuss.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot. We'll finish there. Thanks for watching the first podcast by Young Thinkers Gloucester. We'll be doing more health and education podcasts in the future. So if you liked it, hit subscribe, hit the like button, and comment below.